All right, so Claude Opus 5 just dropped, and Muse Spark 1.1 is right there trying to take its spot. On Arc AGI 3, Opus 5 scored 3 times the next best model, which is a gap that's pretty hard to ignore, you guys. Both models launched within the same window, so right now is exactly when you want to make this call. I'm comparing Claude Opus 5 versus Muse Spark 1.1 across 14 verified sources and 0 vendor spin. What surprised me? The cheaper model might actually be the smarter pick for your workflow, depending on one specific thing about how you're running API calls at scale, and you won't know which until the end. So this one's for developers and teams who are actually paying per token every single month, because if you pick the wrong model, you're either leaving reasoning quality on the table or you're burning 4 to 6 times more money than you need to, and both of those hurt. The right call here is use case driven. And I want to show you exactly where each model earns its price tag. Test 1 long-form reasoning and multi-step accuracy. When a model gets this wrong, your agent doesn't just give a bad answer, it confidently chains 5 wrong steps together, and you don't catch it until the output is already in production. And debugging that costs real time and sometimes real money. What I found here is pretty lopsided, though take it with a grain of salt, because most of these benchmarks are one-sided. On Frontier Bench version 0.1, Opus 5 more than doubles its predecessor score and leads all models, and on Zapier Automation Bench, it passes about 1.5 times more tasks than the next best at the same cost, while Muse Spark 1.1 just has no published scores on these suites. Now, honestly, the gap is a little misleading because Muse Spark 1.1 does lead MCP Atlas full use at 88.1. And there's a disputed terminal bench result that got flagged for resource cap violations by an ex-Meta employee who actually maintains that benchmark. So for pure agentic orchestration, the picture is messier than the headline numbers suggest. Claude Opus 5 takes test 1. I was expecting Muse Spark 1.1 to be closer on reasoning, given all the hype, but on every suite where both models have published numbers, Opus 5 wins and it's not close. And Arc AGI 3 at 3 times the next best model is the number that stuck with me. That puts Claude Opus 5 up 1-0. Test 2, creative writing style and originality. The failure mode here is generic, flat output that sounds like every other AI response you've ever read, and your users notice that immediately because it erodes trust in whatever product you're shipping, and no amount of reasoning power fixes prose that just sounds robotic. So I looked for source benchmark data on creative writing for both models, and honestly, there's nothing to show you on screen here. Neither vendor has published a creative writing score. Anthropic mentions stronger visual outputs as a proxy but cites no number, and community reports say Muse Spark 1.1 surprises on creative tasks, but that's anecdotal and I can't verify it. And yeah, the hard truth is neither model is really positioned for creative writing as a primary use case, and Anthropic is pushing Opus 5 toward agentic coding and enterprise work. Muse Spark 1.1 is built for orchestration, so this dimension coming up unverified is kind of by design for both of them. One's a tie, and I was expecting at least some benchmark to exist here, but there's genuinely nothing sourced on either side, so I'm not going to crown a winner on community anecdotes, and the score stays at Claude Opus 5.1, Muse Spark 1.10, with one test tied. Test 3, API pricing per million tokens. This is the one that actually kills projects. You prototype on a model, everything looks great. Then you scale to 1 million calls a month, and suddenly your API bill is eating your entire margin. And that's a real thing that happens to indie developers and small teams all the time. What surprised me here is how wide the gap actually is. Claude Opus 5 runs $5 input and $25 output per million tokens. Muse Spark 1.1 is $1.25 input and $4.25 output, which is 4 times cheaper on input and roughly 6 times cheaper on output. Verified across artificial analysis, Open Router, and AI Weekly, and while Opus 5's batch API at $2.50 input partially closes it, Muse Spark has no published batch tier. Now, the cost gap matters way more at scale than it does on a small project. If you're running a few hundred calls a day, the difference is maybe a few dollars. But if you're literally hammering it with agentic pipelines at volume, that 6 times output multiplier is the difference between a product that's profitable and one that isn't. Muse Spark 1.1 takes test 3, no contest. I knew it'd be cheaper going in, but I wasn't expecting the output gap to be nearly 6 times. And at $4.25 versus $25 per million output tokens, that's a real cost difference for any team running at scale. So now we're tied. Claude Opus 5.1, Muse Spark 1.11 tied. Test 4, context window and retrieval fidelity. The failure mode here is subtle and nasty. The model advertises 1 million tokens, you load up a huge document, and then it just quietly misses something buried in the middle. The answer looks fine, but the model dropped a chunk of context and your output is wrong in a way that's hard to catch. Both models advertise 1 million tokens, so that's tie on raw spec. But what I found interesting is Muse Spark 1.1's retrieval fidelity under pressure is described as mixed on pure long context tasks, without tool augmentation per independent community sources. And its hallucination rate did drop from 73% down to 38%. On AA Omniscience, which sounds good, but accuracy stayed flat at around 41%. So that improvement is abstention, not comprehension. To be fair, Opus 5 has no published retrieval fidelity score on any independent benchmark either. So the data on both sides is pretty thin, but what we do know is Opus 5 has a documented 128,000 max output and a 512 token minimum cache threshold. And Muse Spark 1.1 has nothing published for either of those, which makes the comparison a little one-sided. Claude Opus 5 takes test 4 on documentation and fidelity evidence. I was expecting a clean tie since both hit 1 million tokens, but the 128,000 max output on Opus 5 with no equivalent published from Muse Spark, plus the mixed retrieval reports pushed it over, and that puts Claude Opus 5 ahead 2-1 with one tied. Claude Opus 5 wins on reasoning, full stop, Frontier Bench, Arc AGI 3, OS World 2.0, Zapier Automation Bench. It leads all of them, and often by a lot. And it also has 128,000 max output tokens with no published equivalent from Muse Spark. And its prompt caching is more mature at a 512 token minimum threshold. With a verified batch API tier, Muse Spark 1.1 wins on cost and tool use orchestration, 4 times cheaper on input, 6 times cheaper on output. And it leads MCP Atlas at 88.1 for multi-agent and browser automation workflows. Plus, it dropped its hallucination rate 35 points to 38% and comes with $20 in free API credits, so you can actually test it at scale before spamming anything. Honestly, I went in thinking this would be closer, but the use case split is pretty clean. If you need the best answer on hard multi-step problems and cost is secondary, Claude Opus 5 is your call, and if you're running high-volume agentic pipelines or you're on a tight budget, Muse Spark 1.1 earns its place at a fraction of the price.